Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest. June 13th, 2024, the Biden's Risky Asylum Policy Edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast in Washington, D.C. Boy, do I have a Crow update, but let me introduce John Dickerson of CBS's Daily Report from New York first. Hello, John.
Hello.
And from New Haven, Connecticut, New York Times Magazine, Yale University Law School, Emily Bazelon. Hello, Emily.
Hey, guys.
Okay, Crow update, mega update, really quickly. So my attempts to make friends with a pair of crows in my backyard who are nesting in a tall tree in my backyard has been failing. I leave out nuts for them. I wave to them. I, try to greet them and stuff. Leave out like shiny objects for them. No interest. This week, their fledgling arrived. Their fledgling appeared. So there's a small crow that suddenly appeared in our backyard on the ground. Didn't realize it at first that was a fledgling. I just thought it was a small bird that the crows were. I thought the crows were harassing this small bird that was on the ground and kind of couldn't really fly. And my girlfriend and I thought it was injured. And they were yelling and chattering around this bird. They were sort of in the other trees and yelling. And then we realized, oh no, this is a fledgling that's trying to fly, learning to fly. And the crows just started attacking me and my girlfriend. They just like whenever we would go in the backyard, whenever we'd get anywhere near where this fledgling was, they just dive bombed us. They never touched me, but you feel the swoop of their wing on them. One of them shat on me once. It was terrifying. I couldn't go out in the backyard. They now seem to have calmed down a little bit. Anyway, my friendship attempts failed. I'm now an enemy of the crows. This week on the Gabfest, Biden's crackdown on asylum, whether it will help him politically. Then, is Europe careening toward the far right? We will talk to Anne Applebaum about the results of the European Parliament elections. And then New York Governor Kathy Hochul canceled the ambitious Manhattan congestion pricing program weeks before it launched, delighting suburbanites and enraging public transit advocates and urban planning nerds, and also enraging me. So we'll discuss that. And of course, we will have cocktail chatter.
Man, that sunset is gorgeous.
Grill, patio, sunset. Hard to get better than that. Unless you're browsing Carvana's inventory while you soak it all in.
Oh, burger time.
So sit back, get comfortable. Carvana's got thousands of cars under $20,000 just waiting for you.
I could stay here forever.
Carvana, where car buying meets comfort, meets convenience. Download the app or visit Carvana.com today.
President Biden, by executive order, vastly constrained the ability of migrants to ask for asylum. He did what he tried to do legislatively. So there was a bipartisan effort to try to address the huge migration on the southern border with constraints on asylum. Trump torpedoed that effort. And so Biden has carried it out by order. He's basically barred people from asking for asylum if they cross into the U.S. illegally, as long as levels of illegal migration are high. If more than 2,500 arrests a day are happening, people are not going to be allowed to apply for asylum. And that 2,500 arrests a day level we've been above that level for years. People who use the Border Patrol's app and cross at an official port of entry to make an appointment can still ask for asylum. And when they do make that asset, that generally allows them some period to be in the U.S. and to live in quasi-legal status in the U.S. over some period of time because the asylum system is so backlogged. So this is a lot more like a Trump immigration policy than you might expect. And it seems to reflect the huge liability that immigration and the southern border have become for Biden and the Democrats. So do you think that this policy change will have political benefit?
Yeah, I mean, it has a political benefit. How big? Don't know. I think the political benefit is Biden had nothing. He had a bunch of bad daily migrant numbers. When you look at the number of migrant encounters at the border by administration, the graph kind of bounces along under Trump and then skyrockets under Biden. There may be plausible explanation. There are some plausible explanations for that. Joe Biden doesn't want to spend 20 minutes, and Democrats don't want to spend a lot of time on that turf explaining why that might be the case, and there are all these other reasons. Now what he's given himself is two things, which is an answer to a question at a debate or criticism about immigration. He can say, I did this thing. And then when the obvious follow-up is, why did it take you so long? And why didn't you do more? He can say, well, because I was trying to do it legislatively, which everybody agrees, though a lot of people on the Republican side won't say this now. Everybody knows that doing it legislatively is the best way to take on immigration. The problem is they just haven't been able to do it for 40 years.
Emily, shifting to the sort of policy itself, there's a real anger, I think, on the left about this. And there's also anger at the left towards sort of the Biden center left at the idea that asylum has become a loophole. There's this term, the asylum loophole, that's breaking the immigration system. And a lot of people are saying, no, asylum is this right guaranteed under international law. How could it possibly be a loophole? But it is kind of a loophole, right?
So asylum comes out of the World War II, really, as a kind of promise the world is making to refugees, right? I mean, there's all this retrospective distress about people trying to flee Nazi Germany, boats full of German Jews that were turned back around the world had to return to Europe. People died in the Holocaust. So we come out of World War II with this idea that if you leave your country and you can show that you have a credible fear of persecution, if you're forced to return, you should have the right to resettle somewhere else in the world. So yes, asylum has a strong foundation in international law. The way in which people talk about it as a loophole is that now people who are migrating, mostly because they want opportunity and to make their lives better, they know that when they show up at the border of the United States or another country, the thing they're supposed to say is that, yes, I have a credible fear of persecution, because that is the thing that will mean that the country cannot usually simply turn you around, which is what Biden is now doing, right? Normally, based on asylum law, what happens is that American officials interview you at the border and then they give you a hearing. You're supposed to come back so that they can actually test whether your credible fear of persecution is stable enough and solid enough. But in the meantime, you get released within the United States, often with an ankle bracelet. Often people do come back for their hearings, but those hearings take a long time because we have an incredibly overburdened immigration court system that doesn't really function in any kind of timely manner. And so, if you're an American who sees all these people coming across the border and thinks this is this like threatening wave of illegal immigration, you see people coming and getting released and counting on asylum law to give them this pause in enforcement that does allow them often to resettle temporarily or for a longer time in the United States, because you can kind of melt into the shadows once your asylum claim is denied, which also often happens. So that's the tension here. When Biden closed the border, what he's saying is you no longer get to present your asylum claims if you come in illegally. Although, as you said, David, he is leaving these other routes open if you go through the app that they've set up or other legal avenues. There's just a kind of real politic tension between this grand promise the world has made and the reality of how many people want to migrate from poorer countries to wealthier countries all over the world. And we've never come up with a kind of real system for allowing them to do that or really reckoned with what that means. And it's becoming worldwide, just this enormously tense, contested political issue.
Is it that we haven't come up with a system, or we failed to enforce the actual system? Because presumably, if you didn't allow people to come through illegally and said, just come through the ports of entry using the system we have set up, that would be following the system. It's just we've been overwhelmed and not put enough money towards those interdictions in the illegal spots, haven't made enough judges. The backlog is 3.6 million people who've made asylum requests that are still being backlogged. I mean, there is a system. It just hasn't been funded or respected.
What I meant is internationally. Like, we don't have a way of, deciding, okay, in this year, for example, because of the war in Syria, there are say 6 million people trying to leave Syria. Where are they all going to go? Let's think about a way to apportion them, rationally and fairly around the world. What happened in that instance was almost everybody ended up in Turkey, another relatively poor country, right? And then we sort of rely on, that's what I meant. There isn't a worldwide system. And then the system in the United States, yes, absolutely, has been entirely overwhelmed by the numbers. And because of the sclerosis in Congress you were talking about, we have not had a legislative answer to that.
The evidence to me that asylum is pretextual is that almost none of the people seeking asylum are seeking it from Mexico. They're from other countries. And it means they have crossed through at least one other country, Mexico, to get to the United States. And if the issue is, like, I'm trying to flee a danger in my home, then shouldn't it be the case that you should have to make an asylum claim in Mexico, if that, or whatever the first country that you can credibly make that asylum claim is? And it's clearly that the U.S. is this economic magnet and an opportunity magnet because we have economic growth, and that's great. But it does seem to me like the fact that most people are not making asylum claims in Mexico and instead are just like, I'm going to get to the U.S. and then I'll do it, indicates that this is a flaw in the system. And we need a cogent policy with lots of legal immigration. We want lots and lots of legal immigration. I want lots and lots of legal immigration. But to do that, you do need like a much stricter, more vigorous, coherent effort to prevent people from coming in without authorization. Because when you have lots of people coming in without authorization, you just lose public trust. You end up with huge communities in the shadows. You end up with what we have in this country, which is this incredibly partisan sense about what immigration is and how damaging it is. And it's agonizing that we're risking legal immigration because so much illegal or gray immigration is happening for reasons of underfunding, mistaken policy choices. I think this is the very least that Biden needs to do to constrain what's happening with this vast migration of people claiming asylum.
Much of the strength of America's post-pandemic, or a pretty good portion of the growth, has been the result of the migrants who've come into America. They seek opportunity and they're finding it. One other thing I would throw in is that 8 Tajiks who came across the border were arrested this week with ties to ISIS in 3 different cities, which maybe didn't get that much attention, but will. Because that makes this not just a labor and economy story, but certainly one of the biggest claims from the president's opponents is that the borders are allowing people who are a danger to Americans into the country.
Do you guys understand? Maybe one of you has read up on this way that I haven't. Like, if you're somebody from Venezuela or Haiti or another country which is really chaotic, distressed, and with which the U.S. doesn't have normal relationships, and you are caught up in this, and you are one of these people who try to make an asylum claim, and the U.S. now says no, you can't make it. What happens? Does Mexico just take you? It's like now it's Mexico's problem.
There are some countries that Biden exempted from this order because the countries won't easily take them back, and so that includes Haitians and Nicaraguans and Cubans and Venezuelans and Colombians. So that's one answer to your question, David. He also exempted unaccompanied kids and victims of trafficking. And one thing about the unaccompanied kids is, of course, then that creates an incentive to have more kids cross the border on their own. There are all these really upsetting just incentives that get created, even though you're making the exceptions for what are really good humanitarian reasons.
Somebody was making the point that obviously if Trump is elected, a policy like this or much even more strict will continue. And that's certainly, we expect that. But I think what's to me so upsetting about the Trump potential policy is that it's also going to implicate all kinds of legal immigration and a huge effort to curtail channels of legal immigration into this country. And that to me is just bad news in all respects. I don't know. This is such a depressing topic. And it's also depressing how potent it is for Republicans politically.
Well, and it's depressing because it's complicated and
there's human suffering and a mass scale. Sorry, you were probably about to say that, John.
And there's human suffering at a mass scale, which is, this gets to the heart of what are your values as a country. And And that's not even really a part of the conversation. Even if you were to have the conversation and say it's a suffering in a mass scale, but we lack the resources to do this because we have to make priorities or whatever, it's just not a part of the conversation. And two other things I would add is that a majority, 6 in 10 voters in the most recent CBS poll said they supported mass deportation. So that's not just what do you do with what's happening at the southern border right now. That's what do you do with the migrants and the undocumented immigrants in the country right now. And then we should also add that Biden this week suggested giving green card status to the undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens, which is a way for him to try to balance this new migration policy. But it's also him having to do it on his own and not through Congress, which is not the way to do it.
I mean, we could do so much better if we had rational bipartisan legislation on this. We could have much more legal immigration. We could then justify a more crackdown approach at the border because we were providing more orderly paths to get in. And we could recognize the incredible benefits that immigrants do bring to this country.
Yeah, although I would not say that we're certainly not unique in handling these things badly. I mean, you have other governments which are, for the most part, more functional than ours. You have the British pursuing this plan, which is not going to be carried out to deport, immigrants to Rwanda. You have in southern Europe, you have all these boats where people are dying by the score, by the hundreds, because boats are being turned away. You have European policies which are forcing migrants who are in Africa literally into the desert with no water and no shelter.
That is amazing.
And it's so Australia putting people on random islands. So yes, we are certainly not unique in handling this poorly. The world is handling it poorly. Do you want to hear more from us after this episode? No response.
Desperately.
Maybe
Emily.
Today.
Okay. Well, then stick around for our bonus segment. Today, we're going to be talking about the conviction of Hunter Biden and what that could mean for the presidential campaign. But that segment is just for Slate Plus members. So if you are a Slate Plus member, thank you. And you've kept us going. If you're not a Slate Plus member, why don't you sign up? Sign up today. And if you sign up, even if you lie on that form where you sign up, no, you are not vulnerable to prosecution, unlike a federal gun application. So there's that. You will get bonus segments of every episode of the Gabfest if you sign up, as well as other Slate podcasts, and you won't hit the paywall on the Slate site. So do that by going to slate.com/Gabfest Plus today. Slate.com/Gabfest Plus. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear the stories making news right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including the policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation fears, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen. This episode of the Gabfest is brought to you by ZBiotics. There's now a game-changing product to use before a night out with drinks. It's called ZBiotics. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, it is tough to bounce back the next day. You have to make a choice. You can either have a great night or a great next day. ZBiotics is a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. And it's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Go to zbiotics.com/Gabfest to get 15% off your first order when you use Gabfest at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/Gabfest and use the code GABFEST at checkout for 15% off. This episode of the Gabfest is brought to you by Home Chef. Are you drowning in a sea of meal kit options? You feel like you're in a bad dating game where every contestant looks the same? Fear not. Amidst the chaos, there is one shining star in the meal kit world worthy of your culinary affection, and that's Home Chef. I've been cooking from Home Chef recently, and I am absolutely delighted. Home Chef has introduced me to new ways of cooking things that I've been curious about and done it in a way that's like incredibly easy, incredibly fun, and quick. Home Chef has fresh ingredients and chef-designed recipes, and they're conveniently delivered right to your doorstep. And whoever has done the recipe design and the steps at Home Chef has done a fantastic job. The recipes were very, very, very clear. For a limited time, Home Chef is offering Gabfest listeners 18 free meals plus free dessert for life. And of course, free shipping on your first box. So go to homechef.com/Gabfest. That's homechef.com/Gabfest for 18 free meals and free dessert for life. You heard that right. Homechef.com/Gabfest. You must be an active subscriber to receive free dessert. Now we're joined by beloved Gabfest guest Anne Applebaum of The Atlantic. Whenever there is a European issue that confounds or delights us, the Gabfest calls on Anne to make sense of it. The European Cup does start today. That's not what we're going to talk about, although that is the confounding European issue that is most fascinating for me. But there is no greater European mystery for me, for most Americans probably, than the European Parliament. It seems to have like a ludicrous number of members, a set of opaque responsibilities, elections on some kind of cycle that I don't understand, and weird results. And this week, parliamentary elections made big headlines in the US, which is unusual because they superficially, and Anna's going to explain why superficially, it was superficial, they seem to indicate further gains by the far right, especially in Germany and France. So, Anne, I think you're here to tell us that there's been a big misreading or big sort of misdirection about what these elections seem to signal.
Yes. Well, first of all, you started with the correct point, which is that most people don't understand it in the Anglo-American English-speaking world. Actually, the European Parliament does have some important responsibilities. It is because of the European Parliament that Apple was forced to have USB, whatever it's called.
Ports?
Because the European Parliament insisted on it, and because Europe is a big enough market, it made Apple do it. So if you want something to be grateful to the European Parliament for, it's that. It is big. There are representations from all the countries, but when they have European elections, these aren't national elections. So you're not voting for your own government. You're voting for the European Parliament. Sometimes countries combine European parliamentary votes with local elections or national elections. Sometimes they don't. And sometimes they do affect national politics, which actually this time they did, but indirectly. And each country has several parties, and there's center left, center right, far left, far right, conservative, green, liberal parties in every country. Almost all of them have, multi-party systems. And so figuring it out is quite complicated. And of course, the British and American press always looks for one headline to explain this whole very complicated, messy thing. And this time the one headline was the far right won and America better watch out. And it is true that in one very, very important country, the results of the far right were really important. And this was France. And the Marine Le Pen's rally has had different names over different times. It's a far right party that goes back actually many decades, won about a third of the vote, which in these elections counts as a lot. And it meant that her party was the largest party in the polling. And because of that, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, announced snap elections. And the reason why he did that was because very often in European elections, because they're not usually connected to your national parliament, people tend to, they vote in protest. They vote against the current government, or they vote for wacky parties who they wouldn't normally vote for. They don't vote in the same way that they vote in national elections. And so he's guessing that people won't vote for Le Pen's party in a national election if it's going to affect their government. One further complicated caveat is that even if Le Pen wins and she repeats her result with 30%, she still won't really be running the country because Macron has 3 years left. And in France, the French president gets to determine French foreign policy and lots of other things. And so it'll be very messy and complicated, but it won't probably mean anything in terms of international politics or France's support for Ukraine, at least not right away. So some of the kind of hysterical headlines, I think, were wrong. In Germany, the far right also did well, although less well than expected. And in fact, the really big winner in Germany was the center right. This is the Christian Democrat Party, who probably will be the next government at the time of the next election. And they are even more pro-Ukraine and even more anti-Russian than the current one. So it didn't look to me like we were seeing some kind of earthquake or catastrophic change. Meanwhile, if you really, really want to go down in the weeds, in Poland, the center-right ruling party did very well and won, and the far-right former ruling party came second for the first time in 10 years. In several countries, the center-left did better than they had done before, and that includes in France and Italy. It includes in Slovakia. In a number of countries, the far right did badly or underperformed, Scandinavia, Spain. So it's actually kind of a mixed picture. And the European Parliament itself doesn't look that different from how it did last time around. I mean, it's true there are more seats for the far right, but also the largest party is the center right, and they've been the largest party for a long time. And that's the party that has the German Christian Democrats and the Polish ruling party and lots of other parties.
Can I ask a question just about France, since it's all my small brain can contain right now? So one thing that occurred to me when I was reading about Macron calling these snap elections is whether it evokes Brexit in the sense of, David Cameron, then the prime minister in Britain having this kind of impulsive decision to take this huge gamble, which he thought he would win, and then he lost. And I realized that Brexit is a gamble of another whole kind and bigger than any decision about who is in power immediately, and also that Le Pen would not be the president of France even if she won this election. And yet, I still just wonder if Macron's doing something in a kind of impulsive moment, which will end up setting France or being part of setting France on a course that is not actually good for him or necessarily good for France.
It's definitely possible. The stakes are a little bit lower in the sense that Le Pen is no longer anti-European. So she's not calling for France to leave the European Union, and she's not calling for France to leave NATO. So one of the other interesting things about these elections, and actually this is something that's been happening over the last few years, is that several of parties that were far right or are far right and have been very radical in the past have toned down their language and their policies in order to win. And we already saw that happen in Italy. But Le Pen has been trying to present herself as a kind of nice grandmother, who just wants the best for all French people, and not as some kind of radical who's going to upset the system. Even letting her in won't mean that, there's some huge revolution in France. I mean, she could win, in which case, if she repeats her result, her party will have 30% of the French parliament and will therefore have to be part of whatever governing coalition there is. But again, then they'll be living in France, they call it cohabitation. So then she'll be living in cohabitation with Macron, who can do lots of things to undermine them and make their lives miserable. So the stakes are a little bit lower. Like even if he gambles wrong and she wins, it doesn't mean an immediate, massive change.
And can you, to the extent it's possible, help us define what far right really means? You already touched on Ukraine a little bit with respect to the economy, immigration, and Ukraine. And then I'll just add a second question, which is, if it's now possibly going to be a little bit more of a muddle in Germany, a little bit more of a muddle in France in terms of power sharing or just messy time spent dealing with a more complicated coalition, could that affect the big question, which is Ukraine? Does it complicate Ukraine?
So with the far right, first of all, that's also complicated because it's a little bit different in each country, because the far right by definition are nationalists. And so they emerge from whatever national or in some cases fascist tradition their country has. And so that makes them all a bit different. But I just to be very vague, I mean, roughly they have historically been against the European Union. They've been against NATO. They've been anti-American. Some of them have been racist, some of them very racist. They've been historically anti-immigration. Some of them have been also, actually even anti-capitalist in a kind of statist way. We don't want these global companies in our country. We want to shut our borders. We want only, Germany for the Germans or France for the French. And they all come from their own truth. So the French far right does have, through a somewhat convoluted chain, does link back to Vichy. I mean, it was the people who were mad at the end of the war that Vichy lost. Okay, that was their origins. The Italian far right links back to Mussolini, and this was Mussolini's party developed into the party that is now Giorgia Meloni's party. So they do have those historical links. In recent years, they've usually tried to distance themselves. I mean, somewhat like European communist parties eventually tried to distance themselves from Stalin. But they have they're historically nationalist, anti-foreign, anti-internationalist, anti-globalist, whatever. Globalist is a new word invented in America. They didn't used to use that. Recently, it's become more muddled because quite a few mainstream parties, especially center-right parties, are also more anti-immigration than they used to be. And also because many far-right leaders have tried to tone down their rhetoric or their language in order to get elected. And in particular, after the Brexit vote, which most Europeans perceive as having been a disaster for the United Kingdom, they all stopped they stopped talking about leaving the EU because that was very unpopular almost everywhere. So you're right to detect that there's a little bit, it's more muddled than it used to be. I mean, and they used to be Germany didn't used to have a far right party. Spain didn't have a far right party. And the French one was mostly very small historically. So they've changed and evolved a bit in the last, I would say even 5 years, but certainly the last 10 years. So that's one question. In terms of Ukraine and kind of big geopolitics, I don't think it affects anything right now. It's true that historically Le Pen has been pro-Putin and she took money from Putin. I mean, the German far right, as far as I can see, is an invention of Putin. I mean, it's pushed very hard by Russian and Russian-linked propagandists. Several of its leaders have had financial links to Russia. The same has been true on the Dutch far right, although not so much with the current party that's doing well. Almost all the far right parties have had some, particularly the older ones, some links to Russia. Most of them have backed away from that recently and have started, they don't openly praise Putin anymore. But it's true that, I don't know, should Trump win our election? Should the war start to go badly? These aren't the people who would be Ukraine's most solid friends, if I can put it that way. And actually, and I do think that the result of the U.S. election will push some of those leaders and some of those parties in a different direction, depending on what decision he takes. And since we don't really know what he's going to do, and he probably himself doesn't know, it's very hard to predict.
Actually, and just to follow up on that, I mean, one of the points I think you make is that in a way, the far right is much more dangerous in the United States, where there is no far right party, because there's only one party that the right.
No. I mean, so the rhetoric that Trump uses, the language he uses, the language his followers use, this whole, the violent harassment of people, I don't know, election workers who are perceived to have not gone along with the 2020 election lie. The January the 6th, a violent assault on the Capitol, an attempt to block election results. Right now in Europe, there aren't any far right leaders who are as extreme as that. So Trump is well to the right. I mean, he's a much more extreme figure. His followers are more extreme. They use more extreme language. They use more violence than right now anybody in Europe. I'm not saying Europe couldn't go that way someday. And, were Le Pen ever to become president of France, it's very possible you would see an assault on institutions and an attempt to undermine democracy in the way that you will see if Trump wins in the US. And actually, one other thing I should say about the far right is the other objection to them historically is they were very often pretty clearly anti-democratic. So it wasn't just that they were anti-immigration. Their language was against the post-war democracies. It was anti-liberal, anti-democratic language, which they've all toned down. But Trump has not toned that down. I mean, he's still talking about revenge on his enemies and using the Justice Department to go after people he doesn't like. And so the language that Trump uses about the state and about destroying the state or undermining the state, most European far right parties now stay away from.
And Applebaum with The Atlantic, thank you so much. We'll be back when there's some other opaque European issue, or less opaque too. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you.
We'll be right back after a short break.
This episode is brought to you by ZBiotics. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. You have to make a choice. You can either have a great night or a great next day. ZBiotics is a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Go to zbiotics.com/slate to get 15% off your first order when you use SLATE at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/slate and use the code SLATE at checkout for 15% off.
It's hard to imagine a world where we leave future generations with fewer rights and freedoms. The Supreme Court has stolen the constitutional right to control our bodies. Now politicians in nearly every state have introduced bills that would block people from getting the essential sexual and reproductive care they need, including abortion. Planned Parenthood believes everyone deserves access to care. It's a human right. We won't give up and we won't back down. Help ensure the next generation can decide their own futures. Donate to Planned Parenthood. Visit plannedparenthood.org/future.
Just 3 weeks before it was going to take effect, the pioneering, enormous congestion pricing plan for Manhattan was indefinitely delayed by New York Governor Kathy Hochul. Under the plan, cars would have been charged $15 to enter Manhattan below 60th Street at most hours of the day, trucks even more, all administered and enforced by an enormous apparatus, $500 million apparatus of cameras and computers. The congestion pricing plan was modeled on similar efforts in London and Stockholm and other cities, and it would likely have significantly reduced traffic in Manhattan, where the average car traveled at 7 miles an hour, which is incredible, and it would have generated $1 billion a year that would have gone directly to the public transit agency for hugely needed improvements to that, both at the sort of safety level and at the rider experience level. So, John, you are an actual Manhattanite. Why did Hochul do this? What's this? What are the actual reasons and the stated reasons?
I mean, the stated reason, she said, is that New York's recovery from the pandemic is too fragile. Rents in the portion of Manhattan that would be protected by congestion pricing are really under a lot of pressure. People aren't coming back to the buildings. And so in that particular area, it's more fragile. And so she worried that this would be chilling on those people coming from out of town who might go to those areas to work or go to restaurants. She talked a lot about diners, which a lot of New Yorkers and those writing about it were like, people don't go driving to diners the way you seem to claim that they do. So people were like, it's not even really working. But the more powerful argument is that it does not pull well even on Manhattan, and it pulls even worse in the surrounding suburbs. And if you look at the battleground congressional districts in New York, almost all of them, depending on what you count as a battleground, but the 1st, 3rd, 4th, 17th, 18th, 19th are all arguably affected. That was either on Long Island or counties near New York would all be affected by this. The 22nd is also battleground, but that's up near Syracuse. So Hochul and New York Democrats were criticized for botching the redistricting of the state and basically giving power to the Republicans. So if this pisses off suburban voters and they punish Democrats, and that causes them not to be able to win back these seats or to hold battleground areas, it could, I'm going a little far here, but it could determine who controls the House of Representatives. So I think that's, certainly in play here as well.
The most charitable possible explanation is she isn't really killing it. She's just killing it until November 10th. And then it comes back around. That's a charitable explanation.
I just find this so frustrating. They put up all the cameras. It's all ready to go. You just have to flick the switch. The subway system in New York is in terrible shape, was promised $1 billion a year in revenue from this plan. Hochul has no idea about how to replace that is viable. The New York legislature ended its session without doing anything about it. I mean, yeah, it's possible she's just putting this off for several months, and maybe that promised political gain for the Democrats will pay off and everyone will congratulate themselves. But it just feels like a big bet to take that it's going to matter that much, and just total betrayal of what the Democrats have been promising to do forever in New York. And the thing about the public opinion polls and how congestion pricing isn't popular, when you look at the other cities like London and Stockholm that David mentioned, of course, people start off with that idea because everybody resists change always, and people don't even really understand what it is. And whoever named it congestion pricing, that is like a terrible label. However, once it's in place and people see less traffic, it actually rises in popularity. And when you look at the incomes of the people who are affected, those people who really are driving in a lot of times to central and southern Manhattan, it's almost all really affluent people. So this is also just blocking a form of economic redistribution that New York promised to do. And then the benefits in terms of, reducing pollution, et cetera, they go to everybody. So it's just so disappointing that, why, what is the point of electing local and state Democrats if they can't follow through with a plan like this?
It is so difficult to make mega investments in infrastructure. And they'd already done the work. It took them decades to get this through the legislature, past governors. They'd install the cameras, and now all to waste. Infrastructure, the start of infrastructure is always costly and inconvenient. No one wants the construction. No one wants them building the damn subway and all the noise. But it's like you have to do that kind of early suffering. You have to endure that and endure the kind of inconvenience to businesses and inconveniences to people so that you can reap these benefits. And will congestion pricing, would it discourages some businesses from locating in Manhattan, some people from coming to work in Manhattan? Probably a teeny little bit. But you know what? Cities that are easy to move around in, cities that have nice public transit that people like to take, cities that have breathable air, cities that don't feel like one big traffic jam. Those are cities people like to visit, cities that people like to live in, cities that people like to work in. And the evidence from London and Stockholm, and London is one I've experienced personally, it is a much nicer city. Central London is much nicer to be around. You can move around so much more easily than you could before. And you also generate all this revenue without having to directly tax people and put that revenue towards so abused, so decaying infrastructure that needs a huge helping hand in order for New York to survive. If you want to see New York die, you want to see New York have mega problems, let the subway system get much worse than it is. That's when New York will be completely and utterly fucked. And it's just so incredibly stupid and short-sighted, and I astonished by it. And it probably came from Biden White House pressure because they don't want to lose the House.
I don't have the answer to this question, but is it totally fakaked if they just wait 5 months?
No, it's probably okay. I mean, they've got the infrastructure. I mean, they probably
if that's the strategy,
put umbrellas over the cameras.
If they come back in several months, we promise to at least note
the strategy. Exactly. It's a strategy. It's a tragedy with a strategy.
I mean, if that's the strategy, though, and they hold that and they take back the House and Trump wins, I think you'll be happy.
I will not be happy if Trump wins. And we need a congestion pricing experiment in the United States. Do you guys know that John Kenneth Galbraith phrase private opulence and public squalor, that's what the United States is, this country of private opulence and public squalor? That's what Manhattan's becoming. Manhattan has all this incredible private wealth, these enormous, skyscrapers, these needle skyscrapers that are owned by, I guess no longer Russian gazillionaires, but gazillionaires, private equity assholes. But the public streets are squalid. And one reason why the public streets are squalid and the subways are squalid is because there's not been the investment, and because there's this endless, horrid, array of traffic through the city. And it's such a clear way to improve the city for the long term. And if Michael Bloomberg were mayor, this would have gone through. Didn't
he try and get it to go through and it failed?
Yeah. But he would not have allowed this to get derailed this way.
And that we should note that this is all being fought out in the courts. So maybe Hochul will lose her. Although by the time, it probably won't get adjudicated by the time they have the election. So
do you guys remember when Chris Christie canceled the $12 billion tunnel between New York and New Jersey? There would have been this enormous economic boost. It's finally back on the books. It's finally going through the Hudson Tunnel. But now it costs like 50% more, and it's a decade late. I mean, so all of this, it's still going to happen. But the city and the state, New Jersey and New York, could have been reaping the benefits from it now, but instead they're not. Let us go to cocktail chatter. When you're viewing the public squalor of your home city and having a drink to allay your despair about it, Emily, what will you be chattering about?
I am really interested in a story this week from South Florida. A jury in Florida found Chiquita banana, as many of us know it. Chiquita Brands, it's called. They sell a lot of bananas. The jury found them liable for 8 killings committed by a paramilitary group in Colombia during the long, basically, civil war in Colombia. And so the allegations here are basically that Chiquita bankrolled this right-wing paramilitary group in Colombia. This is between the years 1997 and 2004 that was murdering people. And now the company has to pay more than $38 million to 16 family members of the people who were killed. This is a really unusual kind of jury verdict. First of all, because it's holding a corporation liable for murders that can be traced to these payoffs it was making. And Chiquita admitted to making millions of dollars in payoffs in previous legal action. And then also because it's a jury verdict in the United States about something that happened abroad. It took decades for this result to be reached. And it'll be really interesting to see if there are other kinds of cases like this where people are able to seek justice in the American courts for this kind of wrongdoing. And then obviously what matters in addition to justice for the families is this question of deterrence. Like, does this check companies that, think of making these kinds of payoffs? Will they think about this kind of liability, and will that deter them from doing these things in the future?
Is it a final disposition or just the jury verdict? So there'll still be a raise of appeal?
It's just the jury verdict, and Chiquita will absolutely appeal. But this has been winding for the courts for so long. They dealt with a lot of the preliminary issues. Anyway, interesting jury verdict in South Florida.
John, what is your chatter?
My chatter is 2 things: a recommendation and then some amusing poll numbers. The first is a recommendation for Asher Perlman's book of cartoons called Well, This Is Me. He's a cartoonist for The New Yorker, my favorite cartoonist for The New Yorker. He also writes for Stephen Colbert's show. Anyway, it's such a delight. I have this book, and just dipping into one of them it refreshes the day. So I recommend that to everybody. The other is a poll that was done by YouGov about people's behavior on planes. And as the good people at Morning Brew put it, airplanes are where all the unwritten social rules get litigated. It feels like maybe the most of any other public space. And here are some findings, and people can decide whether they comport with their own values. Letting your kids play in the aisle, is that appropriate? Do either of you think on a plane?
For how long?
A long flight. Yeah, I think so.
A little bit.
86% of the poll respondents said it was unacceptable. What about to get drunk?
On the plane?
Yeah.
I mean,
Unacceptable.
I think that's...
Yes.
I mean, I guess it depends how you
Yeah.
behave. If you're just like quietly drunk in your seat, I don't care. If you're raucously drunk, then no, not okay. If you want to talk to me over and over again, bad.
All right. Now we're going to get to the more important questions. Armrest. Is it unacceptable to use both armrests when someone is sitting next to you?
Yes.
75% said yes. Is it acceptable to wake up a seatmate to go to the bathroom?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. You guys are in keeping.
I mean, you
with
have
the
to
world.
really have to pee. You
Yeah,
shouldn't,
you
like,
can't
make
just
it up.
pee.
You can't do it lightly.
All right. So this is the final. This is the final one. What about taking off your shoes?
I think it's okay.
Yes. I mean, I
I do
do that.
Well,
See, this is the line between me and John Dickerson.
Yeah, the
you
bear-
never take your shoes off on the plane? I mean, I leave my socks on.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I sometimes do, but I'm
That's
not.
why they provide you with socks, like when you're on.
Why do you care?
Oh, well, because I think it probably not everybody who removes their shoes have the most pleasant smelling feet.
Have you ever really like had a foot odor problem on the plane? That's like of all the things that happen to me on planes, that is not a thing I
on
ever
a plane?
remember
Yeah, I'm with
experiencing.
Emily.
You remember, I used to spend a lot of time on the road.
I think-
so. Maybe I have a.
That's true.
I think shoes are a health issue. Like when you need your feet expand, and shoes become super uncomfortable.
Well, that's an excellent point. Also, you're supposed to walk up and down the plane to keep from having thrombosis. So,
Yes.
what are you going to do? Walk in your crunchy shoes? Excellent point.
Can I name the one bit of airplane etiquette that drives me bananas? Which is there is this trend.
Finally,
Nice. It
took
took a
us a
while.
minute.
It took a while.
That was good.
Where you land and people who are like in row 36 like race up to get to row 26 before other people can get out of the aisle. And it's like, dude, just wait. It's ridiculous. I mean, if the flight is late and your connection, that's one thing. And they usually tell you, please let these people go first. That's one thing. But like if people are just trying to like inch by you, like there's an etiquette. You let the row in front of you empty out. That's how it works. My chatter, also a double chatter, not nearly as entertaining. First of all, some super log rolling. If you are in the Nashville DMV, Nashville DMV.
Wait,
If
no,
you
yes,
are-
keep
yeah.
that going. If you're in the Nashville DMV.
No. If you're in the Nashville metro
super
area.
narrow podcast.
The Nashville metro area. We in the district call our metro area the DMV. If you're in the Nashville metro area or you're in the Austin metro area, there is now a daily podcast and a daily newsletter for you about your city. So we have Hey Nashville is a daily newsletter and CityCast Nashville is a daily podcast. And Hey Austin and CityCast Austin are a daily newsletter and podcast in that city. We launched this week. They're great. We launched on Tuesday with interviews with the mayor of Austin and the mayor of Nashville, and we'll be with you every day. So please check them out. Hey Nashville, Hey Austin, CityCast Nashville, CityCast Austin. My other chatter is it's probably this is probably the only book that's ever been double chattered on the Gabfest, because I'm sure that Emily has chattered it before, which is I'm listening to Open, the Andre Agassi memoir from 2009, and it's incredible. I'm not, unlike you guys, I'm not a tennis player, not even a tennis fan. I don't really have that much interest in Agassi. It's just an amazing book about an incredible life and how terrible can a father be? Like, is it possible to have a romance with Barbara Streisand when you're 23 and she's 51? It is. Can you dump Barbara Streisand for Brooke Shields? You can. Can you talk about your hairpiece for like literally chapters at a time? You can.
And that's the best part of the book because it flies off in the middle of a big tournament.
It doesn't quite. It doesn't.
Okay.
It almost does. It almost does. His hatred of Michael Chang and Jim Courier, it just comes through. It's just a wonderful, vivid book. His ghostwriter was J.R. Moringer, who also wrote the Prince Harry memoir Spare, or helped write, I should say. Anyway, Open by Andre Agassi. It's incredible. Would you not agree, Emily?
It's a totally fabulous book, and I'm always really excited when non-tennis fans discover it.
Roger Federer is one of the men. I know several men who he is their male icon. He's like the person they want to be in the world.
Can I say a Roger Federer tennis thing? He said that he won something like 85% of his matches, but only 54% of the points, which is so helpful for me in understanding why tennis is such a frustrating sport to play and why I remain like capable of mental breakdown every time I play tennis.
Yeah.
That's an amazing statistic.
It's insane. I mean, I guess if you thought of like how many times you miss a basket in basketball or like miss a pass in soccer, maybe it's similar. Maybe, but I mean, it is just a sport in which you constantly...
It's different. No, because it means your opponent won 46. His opponents won 46% of the points and only 15% of the matches.
Right.
That's a really interesting point because Michael Jordan has this famous quote saying, I've missed more than 9,000 shots. I've lost almost 300 games, 26 times. I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. And he says, I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that's why I succeed, which is a wonderful version of the same thing that Federer was pointing out when he said that, you basically, you fail. That's how you learn to succeed, and also like let it go past you. But as you pointed out, David, when Jordan misses, well, I guess on the other hand, I mean, when Federer loses a point, it's to another person. Like it's right there in front of you, and that's a different mental dynamic.
It's a zero-sum game. Like in a basketball, you miss a shot, the other team doesn't get a point. Like other things can happen. Whereas you miss a shot in tennis, the other guy gets a point. So only one person can get that point. And it's incredible that with 54%, he gets 85%.
Right. And what that means is he's winning almost all the big points. And that is the difference between champions and the rest of us, mere mortal, often losers.
Listeners, top that set of chatters. We hit everything. We had lots of good listener chatters. Please keep them coming. Please email them to us at gabfest@slate.com. And this week's listener chatter comes to us from Jason Anderson.
Hi, Gabfest. My listener chatter is about the Museum of Science and Industry, a gem in Chicago and the only remaining building from the fabled White City built for the 1893 Columbian Exposition. The museum has recently been renamed the Griffin Museum of Science and Industry after Ken Griffin. Griffin donated $125 million to the museum in 2019, but a few years later he moved himself and his company out of Chicago and into Florida. Still, he got the naming rights. I encourage you to check out a column by Neil Steinberg in the Chicago Sun-Times, where Neil reminds us that the museum began with a donation from Sears executive Julius Rosenwald, who deliberately did not put his name on the museum because he believed that anonymous giving is the highest form of charity. The column harkens us back to a time when a person's honor was earned and not bought.
That's our show for today. The Gabfest is produced by Shana Roth. Our researcher is Julie Hugan. Soldiered through despite illness, came through always. Nice job, Julie. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Ops. Alicia Montgomery is the VP of Audio for Slate. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson, I'm David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We will talk to you next week. We're actually going to be together. We're going to tape together next week. Remember that. So it'll be a special episode. You may have seen Hunter Biden, President Biden's son, was convicted of 3 felony counts. 2 of those accounts were for lying on a gun application, and one of the accounts was for illegally owning a gun for 11 days. It was in a locked box in his trunk and never loaded and never used. These counts carry up to 25 years in prison, but he hasn't been sentenced yet, and so we don't know what possible sentence he will face. But it is astonishing that each of those counts is up to 20 plus years in prison. Astonishing. We talked about the trial and the case itself last week. Now that Hunter Biden has been convicted, I think the question comes up is, will this have an impact on the presidential election? Obviously, it has an impact on Hunter Biden and his family and his children, and on President Biden, it will have an enormous, no doubt, emotional impact on them. But let's discuss the political impact. John, what are the possible ways this plays out, if at all?
I think, who knows, in this race, everything's so locked up. Although I do think that, the former President Trump being referred to as a felon all along, I still do think that has a chance to matter in the race. But in this case, Hunter Biden isn't running for president. It's a story. It's a family story that I bet a lot of people can associate themselves with if they've had addiction struggles in their family. And as J.V. Last wrote in the Bulwark, at every turn, Biden and his administration and his family have behaved in keeping with the norms that we usually expect and associate with the president, which includes letting, a prosecutor from Trump's Justice Department continue on in the case, giving that David Weiss, the U.S. attorney in Delaware, independent counsel status, not interfering with the case, not bellyaching about the judge who was a Trump-appointed judge who unwound the plea deal. Basically, at every turn where you would have expected were former President Trump involved in this, all kinds of madness. Biden did none of it. When the verdict came in, he said, "I abide by the ruling, and he'll appeal." And basically, and then he went to go visit his son on the tarmac. Like, he did all of the things that you would expect a president to do, and he'll get, I don't know.
That was just a snippet from our Slate Plus conversation. If you want to hear the whole conversation, go to slate.com/Gabfest Plus to become a member today.
At the Coca-Cola Company, Keurig Dr. Pepper, and PepsiCo, our bottles might still look the same, but some of them can be remade in a whole new way, using 100% recycled plastic. New bottles made using no new plastic except the caps and labels. You'll be seeing more of these new bottles in more places, and that's thanks to you, because when we get more bottles back, we can use less new plastic. Learn how our bottles are made to be remade at madetoberemade.org.